The Fiendwood, Chapter 1. The unbound Mazik scratched at his long, unkempt beard, wondering how long it would take for his guest to arrive. It was getting late in the day, and Mazik was craving his nap. He supposed that he could simply fall asleep here on the Great Bridge while he waited. It was not like he would be in any danger. The fiends crossing the bridge made sure to keep a safe distance from him. Interesting behavior. They must have instinctively understood just what Mazik was. Oddly intelligent considering the maddening pain they felt, to know not to try and wound Mazik. It was strange, though. Mazik had certainly not told any fiends what he was, so how was it that they knew to avoid trying to harm him? Again, Mazik found himself thinking that it was a part of their base instincts after all. Mazik could cause pain far beyond anything the creatures had ever felt in the entirety of their cursed existence, and a fiend with even half a wit would do well to avoid that pain no matter what. He kicked his legs over the lip of the bridge, staring down at the rushing water below. The shots were all impressive in their own rights, almighty torrents that barely any ship would be able to cross without utilizing foundation. It was no surprise that trade between nations was all but impossible without the use of the great bridges. Fascinating constructions, they had been around since before the Menra era, when Mazik had been born. Setstone was a truly wonderful material to be able to withstand 9 godling wars without even a scratch. Should he take some of the bricks to build himself a new fortress on the icy lashes? He doubted that anyone would notice a few pieces missing. Yes, he'd start gathering them now as he waited for Unbound. Mazik heard a booming voice say from behind him. Mazik grinned and turned his head, a sudden gust of wind blowing his hair back as he stared at the imposing figure before him, standing a head taller than the highest ogre and clad in silvery scaled armor. The man seemed to have stepped right out of legend. Indeed, he had the features for it, strong chin and hard cheekbones, on full display due to his clean-shaven face. Golden eyes regarded Mazik with what appeared to be contempt, or perhaps mild annoyance. It was hard to tell. Mazik had always enjoyed poking fun at these creatures. Their great pride had always been so much fun to whittle away. Of course, only one such as Mazik would be able to do so. Anyone else would certainly be turned into paste, had they tried to insult such a monster. Dragon of the East. Mazik said with a smile, "I'm glad you finally arrived. I was beginning to grow bored." He continued, standing from the ground and turning from the shot to fully face the new arrival. "I'm sure you understand what happens when I grow bored. You may have just saved the world." The dragon smoothed back a lock of silver hair from his brow, merging it with the rest of his long mane as he glared down at Mazik. "Spare me your words, Unbound. I suggest you say only what is needed, else you may suffer the consequences for wasting my time." "Oh. Well," Mazik asked, quirking a brow, "do you intend on invoking the right of challenge upon me?" The dragon said nothing in response, standing there with face hard as stone. Absolutely unreadable this creature was, even for Mazik. Wise decision. All the dragons that have challenged me in the past to become the Unbound have ended up as fish food. Mazik continued with a chuckle. "And I truly do not think you would make for a good meal for my pets. Get to the point. Why have you drawn me here to this place?" The dragon asked, crossing his arms over his chest as he continued to glare down at Mazik. Mazik hummed, placing a hand on his chin. "Well, for starters, that armor is very tacky," he said. approaching the dragon to kick his shin lightly. Perhaps go for black and red? Or perhaps pink. That would suit you better. The dragon then turned his back and began moving away from Mazik. Wait! It is just a jest. Mazik shouted quickly, trailing with a laugh and catching the dragon by his elbow. I just thought I would let you know that your nephew is heading this way. If you wanted to meet with him. Nephew? The Eastern Dragon said, shrugging off Mazik's hand as he turned to face him. I am the only dragon of Dekuma, the last dragon. You know this. I cannot have any nephews. Save me your foolishness, Unbound. We are done here. While it is true that you are the only dragon of Dekuma, Mazik continued, rubbing a hand through his long brown hair, you are by no means the only dragon that has ever lived. You know, Mazik continued, mouth quirking up in a grin. This nephew comes from an older brother of yours, I suspect. A much older brother. The dragon of the East then furrowed his brow a moment, before giving a small shake of the head. None of the dragons from the previous ages still live Maisie. They all died invoking the right of challenge on Zawad. You know this. Not all of them. Mazik said simply, turning his back to the dragon to stare out across the shot. A truly gorgeous river, stretching infinitely towards the sun on the horizon. Did the dragon appreciate the view as well? Mazik turned to ask that very question, only to see that his guest had already departed. The Unbound laughed, placing a hand to his mouth as he continued to chuckle. The dragon must not have liked what Mazik had implied. Mazik understood, though. The potential return of the banished child was a terrifying thought. Chapter 2. Across the Fiend Bridge. Kidka held on for dear life to the rim of the wagon, his guts churning as the world passed by in a blur. He genuinely was beginning to fear that the canvas roof would tear off from the rapid pace Hoplite maintained. It was like the thick cloth was being buffeted by gales from a storm. Hoplite truly was faster than a horse. The Outworlder had claimed that he'd be able to cross the bridge in 7 days, a feat that Elam had disbelieved. Kidka himself hadn't believed it either. But now that they were speeding across the great bridge like an oversized wisp, well, Kidka was more convinced of Hoplite's claims. Elam, too, looked convinced, what with how he did not else but goggle at Hoplite, jaw tightly clenched while he desperately clung to the boards of the vehicle. The Ifrit's normally crimson flesh had paled considerably once Hoplite had reached his full speed. It was a sight that Kidka himself had never seen, not in all their years of knowing one another. Kidka gasped when Hoplite hit a small bump, sending the wagon flying a couple of inches off the ground for a brief instant before it crashed back to the ground. Could you slow down just a little bit? Alistair shouted, tone bordering on anger. I nearly lost my dinner. Hoplite did not respond, likely because he could not hear Alistair over the wind. Either that, or Hoplite was ignoring him. The result was the same either way, as Hoplite did not slow his pace a single bit, his faceplate firmly facing the horizon. Only the very tip of the sun could be seen on the horizon, indicating that night would soon be upon them. Just when did Hoplite intend to stop and rest? He could not avoid fiends very well if he could not see them. There was also the fact that everyone in the wagon would have to sleep at some point, and with how rough this journey was, there would be no way for anyone to rest. It wasn't like they would have to camp in the middle of the bridge. Kidka was certain that Hoplite had seen at least one of the dozens of stone hallways lining the great bridge's walls. Those wide halls all led to roofed rest areas for passing wagons, much like every other great bridge in the world. Had no one told him about that yet? Kidka had not been paying too much attention to the words exchanged between Hoplite and the rest of the party when it came to planning this trip. His thoughts at the time had been purely on how he planned to remove Kazan's head from his body. Kidka's father hadn't done anything to deserve such a cruel fate at the Lord of Hate's hands. Ever since that day, Kidka had been filled with quiet rancor, his calm exterior belying the hot rage that dwelled within. Father had taught him to keep his strongest emotions hidden, and Kidka had done his best to uphold that advice. When the day of reckoning came for Kazan, Kidka would keep a straight face, both during the final fight and afterward. Exposed emotions were as vulnerable as gaps in armor, and Kidka would not allow that weakness to be exploited. That was something that Hoplite seemed to have a good understanding of. Kidka felt that he could learn a lot about stoicism from the massive man. Only Hoplite seemed to understand the importance of hiding one's emotions, as Kidka did. Twindle had always told him that hiding emotion was unhealthy in the long run, but she just did not understand how those feelings could be exploited by an intelligent foe. Back in the Foewood, Lance had managed to see how nervous Kidka was at being approached by her, and had moved in to use that weakness to her advantage. She had basically bullied him to try and get Kidka to confess the name of who had trained him in the ways of the Watcher. It wasn't Theopalu, as she had initially suspected. In truth, Kidka's mentor hadn't been an elf at all, but the training was Watcher given nonetheless, just second-handed. Thankfully, Kidka had been able to deflect her questions effectively, and Theopalu had helped erase suspicion by vouching for it. Kidka had berated himself afterward for letting his mask slip up in that instant. But what was he to do? The Watcher had approached him with knowing in her eyes. He had felt like a rabbit in a snare beneath that green gaze. Kidka had, at the time, believed that Lance already knew everything about him. He knew that wasn't the case now, of course, but Kidka would be sure to keep his mask more firm in the future. The others in this party would be wise to do the same. That wasn't to say they were emotionally unstable. Far from it. Yet there were quirks they all had that could be exploited. Alistair's temper, for example. He usually had a good rein on it. But once the Athiar was provoked to the height of his rage, Alistair would throw caution to the wind to destroy whoever had wronged him. The warrior that strikes out in blind rage is always at a disadvantage against a calm and collected opponent. Thankfully, it took a lot to push Alistair to that point. But if he was overtaken by battle rage during the coming battle with Kazan, Kidka had a feeling it did not end well. Again, it wasn't only Alistair that was at risk of being overcome by their treacherous emotions. Every single person in this wagon hated Kazan with a fury that threatened to wipe away all self-control. Well, everyone save Theopalu and Lance, the former uncaring and the latter practically shaking in her cloak at the mere mention of the Lord of the Hate. Everybody else, though, if Kazan managed to provoke them, well, if it came to that, Kidka would have to do his best to ensure that the party would remain calm. Hopefully, that responsibility wouldn't have to land on just his shoulders, for Twindle was far more proficient at keeping them all tranquil in conflict. But if Twindle lost her self-control, he inwardly sighed. Well, who was he kidding? She was far more in control of her emotions than he was, even though she wore them openly. Still, Kidka knew just how much Twindle reviled Kazan, and that kind of hatred could muddy anyone's senses. His eyes then found Hoplite, the man continuing to lug the wagon like a horse, jumped up on raw foundation. If Hoplite came to aid in the slaying of the Lord of Hate, that would be a relief. The man wouldn't be swept up in emotion during the fight, as he only viewed Kazan as a potential obstacle, nothing more, nothing less. As an outworlder with no connections to Akulis, that made sense. His companion Michael was an outworlder as well, though Kidka could tell that he despised the Lord of Hate just as the rest of them did. The way Michael clutched his thunder staff, and how he glaring toward the sickly horizon let Kidka know exactly how the outworlder felt. It made sense, though, for Kazan was the one who had sent Michael's star crashing into the fiend wall. Michael had been trapped beneath tons of rubble for days on end, surrounded by the rotting corpses of his comrades, in the darkness, all alone. Kidka wondered if Michael had a fear of the dark after that experience. He would not look down on the outworlder if that was the case. Few people could come out of a horrific scenario like that unscathed. Now that it was beginning to grow darker outside, how would Michael fare? Would he become a liability in the field? The Fiendwood was a land of near constant darkness. At least, that was what most suspected. It was close to the icy lashes, where the sun's rays barely touched Oculus. If Michael did indeed have nectophobia, as Kidka expected, then he'd need to work hard to quickly overcome his fear. Kidka doubted it would be easy, though. Such scars usually took years to heal, and sometimes they just never did. Kidka knew that his scars sure hadn't, and they never would. His nature as a Pillowborn ensured that he'd never live long enough to see them heal. Unless he ascended, of course. He frowned, quickly turning his attention from that dire eventuality to instead stare at Hoplite's back. They would need to stop soon, and for some reason, no one else had decided to let Hoplite know that it was time to rest. Maybe everyone was too nervous to stand. The speed Hoplite maintained was quite intimidating. If that were the case, then Kidka would have to take the reins. Now, what was the correct thing to say? Kidka practiced his words for a couple of minutes, rehearsing them silently beneath his red scarf, until he was satisfied with their delivery. He then began crawling on all fours toward the front of the wagon, receiving odd stares from Elam and Alistair as he went. Twindle seemed preoccupied with staring out of the back of the wagon, likely meditating on her ways of tranquility. Theopalu and Nolvi both somehow seemed to be napping, despite how rough the ride was. If they could sleep through this, then they could probably sleep through a godling war. Lance and Michael, who both sat just behind Hoplite in the front of the wagon, paid no heed to Kidka until he passed into their periphery, causing both of them to jump in their seats. "Whoa!" Michael shouted, blue eyes narrowing in a glare. "You can't just go sneaking up on a Marine like that. I could have shot you by accident." "I couldn't even hear you approaching," Lance breathed, her skin going a shade of pale. "I thought a fiend had somehow gotten aboard." Her green eyes then found Kidka's, and her brows lifted in preparation to deliver a scolding. "For the sake of my heart, don't do that again." Kidka struggled. "It was an accidental mistake, sorry." He apologized, keeping his voice as flat as possible despite the horrid awkwardness he felt. "Accidental mistake. Why on Arcules would he utter such mouse salad?" Kidka didn't wear his frustration on his face, keeping his expression neutral as he gripped the edge of the wagon. Now, how did the words he practiced go again? That interaction with Lance and Michael just now had scrambled his script. "We have to need stopping," Kidka began, choking on his words for a brief instant before continuing. "Wait, sorry, we have to stop now. It's getting dark." He shouted at Hoplite's back. "Negative," Hoplite replied loudly. "My suit allows me to see in the dark. It will be more optimal to keep running through the night. Lance winced at those words, cupping a hand around her mouth and shouting, "Kidka is right, Hoplite. You may be able to keep running, but we can't sleep."